I'm Sarah Hayett in Lafayette College. I'd like to welcome Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. She is a professor of law at UCLA and Columbia University and an expert in the fields of civil rights, Black feminist legal theory, and race, racism, and the law. On top of that, she's also the director of the Center of Intersectionality and Social Policy at Columbia University, which she co-founded in 2011, and also the co-founder of the African American Policy Forum. On top of that, she's the creator of intersectionality theory. We're so glad to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And speaking of intersectionality, that actually leads us right into our first question. For the students who may not know, what is intersectionality? Can you define that for us?
Well, I have to practice my elevator version of it, but intersectionality is basically the idea that we experience life, sometimes discrimination, sometimes benefits based on a number of different identities that we have. The basic term came out of a case where I was looking at Black women who were being discriminated against, not just as Black people, not just as women, but as Black women. So intersectionality was basically a metaphor to say, well, they've got race discrimination that they're facing coming from one direction, they've got gender discrimination coming from another direction, and they're colliding in their lives in ways that we don't really anticipate and understand. So intersectionality is basically meant to help people think about the fact that discrimination can happen on the basis of several different factors at the same time. We need to have a language and ability to see it in order to address it.
I know my journey to women's and gender studies was based on intersectional factors. Like, I'm Jewish and I'm a woman, and being raised in a Reformed Jewish family with a female rabbi was a huge. It really informed my feminism.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, what was your journey to women's and gender studies and intersectionality?
That's a wonderful question. So I was raised by a mother and father who were deeply involved in the civil rights movement. We talked about social justice at the dinner table every day. When I came home, my friends used to tease me because I had to study for dinner. Like, my parents wanted me to talk about, what did you learn today? What did you observe today? How do you defend what you think?
No pressure.
No pressure, exactly. So that's the household that I grew up in. And my mother is what I guess in the last century we used to call race women. They're women who were deeply committed to the idea of racial justice, and they were committed to fighting for the rights of people of color, including and especially women. So she would talk about some of the ways that racism gets experienced by Black people who are women, not just Black people who are men, and basically give me tools to see when it was coming at me. So, different ways that you might be spoken to as a Black woman as opposed to being a white woman, having to keep your eye out for harassing behavior at work. Sexual harassment actually came from Black women's employment experience. The first plaintiffs were Black women because these are kind of things that would happen to Black women in the workforce. So just the general way in which you're a woman but not quite the kind of woman that you're supposed to be. These are the kinds of things that my mom taught me about. So I had sort of a race lens from the family as a whole, and then my mother would talk more specifically about, now as a woman, these are the things that you're going to have to look out for. So I was kind of naturally drawn by the time I got to college, both to Africana studies, which I was one of my majors, and the other major was government, and then I did a minor in women's studies.
To go back to what you said about your parents, that they were involved in the civil rights movement, and nowadays there's kind of this resurgence of Black Lives Matter. But the names that stand out in the Black Lives Matter movement and get the most attention are Eric Garner and Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, but we don't see the Yvette Smiths or the Renisha McBrides. And why do you think that is, that the Black women who are also suffering from the systemic violence are getting kind of pushed under the rug, not getting that national attention?
Yes. Well, it's an issue that I've been very much concerned with, and it was one of the reasons we started Say Her Name, to draw attention to the names that people don't have. They don't roll off the lips. We don't know, the names of Tanisha Anderson and Michelle Cusseau. I've thought a little bit about why this is the case, and I can share that we have been participating in some of the marches. We were participating, for example, in the Eric Garner March when we came up with Say Her Name, because, a part of the march is you're marching and you're lifting up the names. And so then we started saying some of the women's names, and people were looking at us like, what are you talking about? And so that's why we just said, well, just say her name. You're right, just say it, because saying it brings attention to the fact that there are women who are also killed by the police. We eventually created a big banner that had the names and the photos of 20 black women who were killed by the police. And for a while we were marching in the march with it, but we realized that actually the poster needed to be seen by people in the march. So we came out of the march and stood on the side, of the road and held up the banner so people walking by would see it. And we noticed that some people gave us the thumbs up. A lot of people were just it didn't compute. The idea of women being killed by the police was just something they'd never imagined. And so they would come over and they took pictures and wanted to know about the stories. And then there were a few people who, were like this, right? This is not about women killed by the police. This is about black men killed by the police. And that goes somewhat to your question. I think that there's a framing of the problem of police violence that's largely influenced by an idea that this is about competing masculinities. This is about, the state, or basically some men clothed with the power of the state trying to constrain, individuals that are seen as hyper-masculine, out of control, and therefore in need of coercive punishment. And there is an element of police violence that is informed by that, but, that's not the only, aspect of police killings that we have to worry about. So, in the same way that lynching, for example, was often framed as an assault on black male sexuality, which many times it was also the cover for many other things that other people were subject to, including black women who were also lynched. So we've been trying to broaden the frame so people can see how state violence is rationalized by a lot of different stereotypes. But the most important one that black women share is that as black people, more of a threat to the police, more likely to engage in conduct that puts police officers' lives at risk, and more in need of harsh disciplinary kind of coercive physical punishment. And we see this in cases that black women have experienced in their homes, in their bedrooms, around the corner from where they live, in their cars, everywhere.
You kind of hinted at this, but one of the biggest critiques of Black Lives Matter is that all lives should matter. What would be your response to it?
Yeah, well, that's, the Black Lives Matter popular version of colorblindness, right? We can't speak with any particularity about the risks that certain things will happen to people who are embodied in a particular way, because to do that is to exclude all the other people, right? So, one of the most tremendously troubling things that happened after the Civil Rights Movement is the way that some of the victories of the Civil Rights Movement have been turned on their head. So, Brown versus Board of Education now